Hello and welcome to day 10. This is Unit 3, Lesson 6. Today we're covering Roman numeral II, the Battle for Germany, spring of 1945, and the Battle for Berlin and the Soviet onslaught. Yes, good times, right? Anyway, we'll get started here. All right. So what do you need to know? Well, I'm looking at slide 8 and slide 9 today, and they are about what happens when the snow melts in Europe. So here we go. When I last talked to you, we were talking about January, how the Battle of the Bulge had come to an end, and things were right about where they had begun. The Germans were back to the Siegfried Line. The Americans pushed up to the Siegfried Line. But the last reserves the Germans had to stop any Allied forces in the West were pretty much used up. So as the snow thaws, the Allies surge forward. They're looking for a bridge across the Rhine, and they will get one at a place called Remagen, Remagan, I think, Remagen, the bridge at Remagen. The reason that it's important is because the Germans cover it with explosives and prepare to blow the bridge, but German troops are still crossing right up to their last second. And as the Allies close in on the bridge, the Germans set off the explosives to destroy it, and they do not succeed. The bridge survives the explosion, and the Germans then have no way of stopping the Allies from crossing the Rhine River. They will cross at several different places, but the bridge at Remagen is probably the most famous. There's one last big airborne drop. This is known as Operation Varsity, where airborne divisions all drop on the east side of the Rhine River on the German side. At the same time, there's like a mini invasion landing craft going across the Rhine River. And there's really, the Germans really don't have anything to stop the Allies with. It's a daylight airborne drop also. An interesting side effect of spring coming is as the Allies close in from both sides, the Russians coming from the east and the American, British, Canadians, and the Free French coming from the west, the German armies, military formations, tend to migrate west. They would much rather surrender to the Americans, the British, even the French, to get better treatment than they would to have to surrender to the Russians. They believe that if they surrender to the Russians, they'll either immediately be killed or they'll end up in prison camps until the 1960s. That is true. That is accurate. What the Americans keep hearing about is something called the Southern Redoubt, the Southern Fortress. Somehow that the German high command and Hitler and all of his staff are going to retreat to the Alps, fortify themselves in some kind of bunker situation, and go on fighting for months and months. And they don't want that to happen. So it's about this time that a conversation occurs where military leaders, especially Eisenhower, go to Churchill and Roosevelt and say, you know what, if Stalin wants Berlin so bad, he can have it. Let's not attempt to attack and capture the city of Berlin. The casualties will be so heavy for our troops. If the Russians want it so badly, they can have it. It ends up costing the Russians about 250,000 casualties. 250,000 casualties. Yeah, just to capture that one city by the time the war comes to an end. Our move, as the Americans, the British, the Canadians, the French move east, what they're trying to do is find the Russians coming from the other direction. Once that happens, they will have pinched Germany in half and then drive south into Bavaria and into Austria to make sure that the Germans are not able to create some kind of fortress in the Alps. That's their plan. So the Americans do finally end up meeting the Russians. And it's a crazy time because American troops moving forward never know from one town to the next whether the town is just going to have a bunch of white sheets hanging from the windows and the Germans have given up and they don't want their town to be destroyed, or the town will resist, and you'll have all these crazy situations with Hitler Youth kids attacking American troops on bicycles. I've seen both sides of this. I may have told, you may remember that when I lived in Germany for 2 years, the girl that I dated when I was 18, her father was one of these kids. He was pretty messed up from this whole thing. I've also seen it from the other side. One of my good friends, his name is Carmen, he was an infantryman in World War II. He's passed away now. He died a couple of years ago. But I did his narrated, wrote up his biography, his military history. And he said you could, every time you came over a hill, there was another town. And they might have white flags from the windows, but you had to be careful. Because the town looked like it was surrendering, but there'd be some fanatic up in an attic with a machine gun. And it would cause casualties every time. But he does remember, the best story he told me was that it was very cold. It was probably February 1945, maybe March. And they had gone into somebody's basement. And they had all gone to sleep. And that somebody was supposed to be awake guarding the house. Well, nobody was. And in the middle of the night, 2 Germans came downstairs where it was warm, laid down and went to sleep in the midst of all of these American soldiers. And in the morning, they woke up and surrendered themselves to the Americans, who were very surprised to wake up and find 2 Germans sleeping there. And the German response was, "Would you take us prisoner if we give you these eggs we found?" And so they traded them eggs for, being protected as prisoners of war. So crazy stories like that. Also, Carmen remembered climbing into bed in some German's house. They took over a town, and he went into the German's house, and the Germans instead sat him down at the table, fed him dinner, took him upstairs, and he took the first shower with hot water that he'd had in probably 3 or 4 months. And after that, he slept in a real bed for the first time in months. And the next morning, the Germans woke him up. He was still asleep. And they woke him up and tried to say in broken English, soldier, you have to wake up. Your friends are leaving. And so the Germans woke him up. They had cleaned his boots and his uniform and everything and sent him on his way. And he realized later what had happened was every time other soldiers tried to bust into their house, they'd say, "No, there's a sergeant. He's already here. He's sleeping. This house is already full." And that's how they kept the rest of the Americans out of their house. But he was so happy about things like toilet paper, which you can understand in this day and age. Anyway, Carmine was a victim of one of those situations where you think the town is clear, and they came walking over the hill, following tanks into the village, and suddenly from an attic, machine gun fire opened up when they didn't expect any, and he was hit one bullet through each leg, and was laying on the ground. And he said getting shot isn't what scared him. What scared him was the tanks were in front of him. And once they came under fire, the tanks put it in reverse and began to back up. And he knew that they didn't see him. And he was shot in both legs, so he had to crawl out of the way to not get run over by his own side. Yeah. Anyway, so there's a German exodus of the Germans rapidly trying to surrender to the Americans, the British, and the French so that they won't have to surrender to the Russians. And sure enough, the two sides do come together. So now you have pockets of German resistance, but the country itself is literally broken. In the meantime, down in Italy, the Americans bust into the Po River Valley at the very end of the war and free up places like Venice and Milan. And the Germans in northern Italy also collapse back into the Alps as a way of building a defensive line. But there's no point because pretty soon there were Americans coming from the other side. So anyway, the battle for Berlin, Roman numeral 3. As I said, Eisenhower decided not to go for Berlin, but instead to leave it for the Russians. Stalin wants to push hard into Germany, because he wants to take a chunk of Germany and turn it into a buffer zone. The other allies don't realize this right away, but he has no intention of rebuilding Germany. He's going to use the part that he captures as a big buffer zone, a barrier. Hitler had formed several groups. The groups that do a lot of the fighting in Berlin, other than the Hitler Youth, were called the Volkssturm, which is basically everyone with 2 arms, and sometimes not even 2 arms, who could hold a rifle. The Germans are encircled in Berlin, but they fight to the very end. As I said, 250,000 Russian casualties. Little kids, there's a movie called Downfall, an excellent movie about those last couple of weeks in Berlin in 1945, which I highly suggest. Anyway, FDR dies on April 12th, and Hitler thinks that somehow this will mean that the war will change, and it won't. But he broadcasts this that says, hey, let's all celebrate. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is dead. Now we're going to win the war, and they're not going to win the war. He celebrates his own birthday on April 20th in Berlin, surrounded by Russians, and we know he doesn't have much longer. So with the Americans and the Russians coming together and the British coming together, the city of Berlin surrounded and slowly being squeezed, I will leave it there until next week. And the exciting conclusion, spoiler alert, the Germans lose. Okay, so anyway, I'll attach some good trailers and things. Once again, Downfall is a very well done movie about Berlin in 1945 and how things actually occurred based on eyewitness accounts of people who survived it. Anyway, that's it, and I will see you all next week. Have an excellent weekend.